6. Okay, so Chapter 6 is public opinion and political socialization. So basically what this is covering is things like political surveys. You might see these a lot like on social media. You might even get a call, especially since we are getting back to election season again with Texas. You might even get a call asking which way you lean, Democratic or Republican, or how you're feeling about some issues. And this is all relating to those political socialization, how your political opinion has developed, basically, and then your opinion about what is going on. Okay, so public opinion. So public opinion is those politically relevant opinions, remember, because we're talking politics here, right? Held by ordinary citizens that are openly expressed. Okay, so these are things like whenever you're out with your friends, maybe talking about Biden or about Trump or about the different officials openly expressing how you feel about different things. That's public opinion. Okay, and election results are a traditional method for assessing public opinion, basically because the election itself is a huge survey, right? It's the people giving their opinion on which presidential candidate or government candidate that will be doing this year, which one they favor, right? So public opinion poll. So this is an estimate of public sentiment. Sentiment, that's just a fancy word of saying feeling. Okay, so estimate of public feeling. Okay, so it measures public opinion using randomly chosen population samples and a carefully constructed interview. So the best way to do this, one of the best ways to do this, would be to get people from many different socioeconomic classes. What does that mean? Many people who earn different levels of income. Those who make less money, those who, as a middle class, make decent amount of money, and those who are in the high elite class who make ridiculous amounts of money, right? And then also people of mixed ethnicities. Get some Asian Americans in there, some African Americans in there, some Anglo Americans. Try and make sure that your population is as random as possible for the best outcome on your poll. Okay, because if you use only one population, being if you use only one age group, if you use only one ethnicity, if you use only one socioeconomic class, so say if you went to the college campus and you took a political sample from that, it's most likely still not going to meet those parameters for being a good sample, because most people in college, even up to teachers, don't make a whole bunch of money, right? And so you may get, depending on what time of day, especially go in the evening, you're getting more of the, or on the weekend, you're getting more of the people who are, a little bit older, they have kids, that sort of thing. But if you go during the day, Monday through Friday, you are most likely going to get students that are just or out of high school, right? Those 18 and 19-year-olds, right? So it really matters about how you are getting that sample and how much of an effort you are making to make sure that your sample is actually representing the overall population. Okay, so the sample is that small group you are polling. The population is the whole. Okay, so if you take this sample, you have a circle here and a circle here, this one representing the sample, this one representing the population as a whole. Okay, so random selection is the key to the best scientific polling. Okay, and again, it needs to be done at a different amount of places, not just one. Okay, so it's theoretically based on probability sampling, which is basically is a fancy way of saying if your sample is going to actually represent the population or not. And it's based in terms of sampling error, basically saying how much you achieve that goal of that sample really actually representing the population. Okay, so public opinion is characterized by various dimensions. So this is talking about different ways in which it can change. Okay, so direction, that's pretty straightforward. Pro or con? Do you approve this issue? Do you not approve this issue? Okay. Intensity, how strongly the position is felt. Okay, what does that mean? What that means is if you are asking, let's say you're asking about immigration. Okay. You don't know what party the person that you're asking is. You're just asking about immigration. Okay. Some parties, like the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, are going to have a pretty strong opinion on immigration, right? But if you go to someone, let's say that they're mostly identifying with the Green Party, that is mostly focused on environmental issues. If you ask someone from the Green Party about immigration, you are probably not going to get the same amount of intensity, okay, the same amount of passion about that one issue, okay? Salience. So this is how important people think an issue is among other issues. Why does this matter? So let me give you an example, okay? Let's say that you have a survey in which it says, how important do you think this issue is among other issues? Okay. Let's say, and we're going to do this in 3 questions, okay? Let's say the first question has to do with ability to go to the supermarket after 10 o'clock. Okay, supermarket be like the store, right? After 10 o'clock. Okay, that's your first question. Second question, let's say, how do you feel about the Texas abortion law that passed? Okay, that's your second issue. Third issue, let's make it a little bit more, not as something that people would react to nearly as much. Let's go with global warming. Some people feel, really strong about it. Others are still kind of on the fence about it, right? Okay, so you have your 3 issues. So we'll put this down. 1, ability to be able to go to the supermarket or the store after 10 p.m. 2, the Texas abortion law. And number 3, global warming, we'll say trends, just means patterns. Okay. So if they ask you, how do you feel about this? How important do you think this is? Okay. And they're asking you, let's say you don't have these in front of you, you're just listening on the phone. Okay. If you hear this, ability to go to the store after 10 p.m. Oh, yeah, well, that's pretty important, maybe I get a craving or I need to eat some study food, or if you're a parent, maybe I need to go get some medicine after like 10 o'clock. Yeah, that could be pretty important. I'll rank that 1 to 10, 1 being the least, 10 being the most. That's an 8. Yeah, that's an 8. Okay. And then they say, okay, well, what about the Texas abortion law? And you go, oh, that's a 10. That's a 10, right? So let me put this another way. Let's say they ask you about this one first, right? Because remember your first answer, the number 1 had been an 8, right? So now we're going to change these. Okay. Same question. They're asking you to rank it again. Okay, so notice, remember our answer before this had been an 8 for number 2, right? That meant that we cared about it a lot. Okay, so same person, they're going to ask these questions again. How important do you feel Texas abortion law is? Oh, that's a 10. You know, yes, I've been very involved in that. That's a 10. Okay. Ability to be able to go to the store after 10 p.m. Are you joking? Is this really a thing? Okay, a 2, right? So notice that the order that you are putting things in really makes a difference, okay? Especially if it's not in front of them, especially if you're just asking them in a survey, right? If it's verbal. The order in which you ask things can have a huge difference in how someone's going to answer that question, okay? So samples are often based on telephone numbers, but some Americans don't have phones. Or, like in my my experience, if I see a telephone number on my phone that I do not recognize, I can guarantee that I don't answer it. Okay, so it's a difficulty in number one for people who don't have phones. And then number 2, for people who don't answer the phone when they don't know the phone number, right? And if you see on your messages, oh, I wanted to ask you about this political issue, you're probably not likely to call back, right? So polled individuals may be unfamiliar with issues, okay? Say if they're asking you about, oh, the income tax amendment in Texas that passed, and how you feel about it. And not a lot of people are familiar with that. Or there's some that are, but there's some that are like, I'm not sure what happened with that. Okay, so those would be non-opinions. And then also, let's say they're asking you about Texas's abortion law or other hot button topics, and you're kind of afraid that what the other person's going to think after they hear your opinion. Respondents are not always truthful. Okay, then we have the issue of direction, intensity, and salience that we just talked about, which can come from those poorly worded questions, poorly ordered questions that could really make a difference in how one responds. Okay, so how do we start to form our political opinions? Okay, this process is called political socialization. All it is basically, it is a process by which one gains, I can't talk this morning, gains their political opinions. Okay, there I am, not being able to type again. So this can happen in a number of ways. It really matters what region you grow up in. If it's heavily influenced by religion, if you grow up in an urban area, which is very city, if you grow up in a rural area, which is a lot of country area, what socioeconomic classes you're surrounded by, what you're seeing, all those different sorts of things really have an impact on our political socialization, our political opinions. Okay, so the process is very continuous. It goes up, it goes down. So it's continuous through our lifetime, but a lot of not everybody, because we do have, people who are majorly Democrat who come from majorly Republican families. So not everybody, and vice versa. But a lot of our opinions come from our childhood and what our family really brought us up under. Okay, so the effects are cumulative. Okay, so this means that throughout a person's lifetime, those experiences build up on one another. Okay, it's not just a clear cut. This is your life in your 20s, taking a pizza slice out, right? This is your life in your 20s. That's your only experience. No, it's from your time you're a baby all the way up to the age that you are now. Okay, it's continuous and it's cumulative, which means it builds up on one another. Okay, and then political socialization takes place through primary and secondary agents of socialization. What's an agent of socialization? They are the people and or the experiences that shape your life, okay, and shape your opinions. So, family is the strongest of all agents of socialization. Because remember, not everyone, but generally your childhood has a huge impact on your political opinions. Okay? Schools, principally early childhood education, meaning mainly things like elementary school, are instrumental in building support for the nation and its cultural beliefs. You notice that in elementary school, there's a huge emphasis on the Pledge of Allegiance, huge emphasis on the founding fathers, and they're not really, talked about as everyday people. They're pretty much put up on a pedestal. All those different things, okay, have a huge impact on our opinions. And our effects of religion can be pretty powerful, okay? Again, not everyone, because just like on, political beliefs and everything, everybody has a sliding scale of where they fall on the, if you believe in God, if you don't believe in God, if you go to church, if you don't go to church, all those different things, right? So it's can have an influence. It's not as much as your schools or your family, mostly because with your family, you kind of look, especially as a child, on how you should be interpreting. It is working through different things that you've learned through at church. Your family has a huge impact on that, especially whenever you're little, right? So with age, whenever we start getting up there, right, getting into high school, college, all those different things, additional socializing agents come into play, because things like peers, so your friends, experiences that they've been going through, or maybe things they've heard from their family. The media, especially if you listen to a very partisan station. What's partisan? That is a station that that really supports one party over another. So, for example, if your media choice is CNN, you're going to have a heavy Democratic influence, and if your media choice is Fox, it's going to have a heavy Republican influence. Okay, and then the leaders at that time, what they are doing. With Trump, how he was a very strong leader, we might have some people turned on to politics, trying to pay attention, and there might have been some people who were very turned off, who didn't like what was going on. So they were influenced that way. George W. Bush, the way that he handled 9/11 and everything, could have really influenced people's opinions on how they really interpreted that event, on how they interpreted the importance of it, and their support of the war on terror, all those different things, okay? And different events, things like COVID, right? That's been a huge one for us. How much the government is effective in dealing with those different events, and it also shapes our opinions, especially things like COVID too. If the government should be able to have a huge impact on our daily lives like they did, or in 9/11, should the government have a whole bunch of power to be able to prevent terrorism with the indefinite holding of people without trial by jury because of the Patriot Act and those kinds of things, okay? So there is a lot of influence, especially from these events, anything that major that happens within your lifetime, leaders, major that happen within your lifetime, a lot of the times presidential, media, what media stations you listen to, and your peers, your friends, okay? So, the reference points by which individuals evaluate issues and developments are acquired through the socialization process. So partisanship, remember that this is party leaning, okay? This is Democratic or Republican. And we do have some Libertarian and Green Party in there too. Ideological. So this, and it's not traditional, the traditional definitions that we think of when it comes to conservative and liberal. Okay, let me tell you why. Conservative is usually associated with the Republican Party, correct? So conservative, though, all it means is that you don't want things or something to change. Okay? Liberal, all that means is that you favor change. You like change. Okay? Whether it becomes one issue, you can be liberal on one issue, you can be conservative on a completely different issue. Okay? And all that's referring to is if you want the things to change in our government or if you like the way it is. Okay? So Americans' frames of reference provide an indication of how they think politically and that form a basis for a common cause. Okay, all this basically says is all these different experiences that we've talked about, all these different influences usually have an indication on how someone's going to think politically because these frames of reference are talking about that political socialization. Okay? So party identification. This is usually an emotional loyalty. So usually you identify, especially as you start to get older, you start to work through your own individual experiences. You start to really do research on what party is really favoring your opinions, especially towards election times, right? With our state elections coming up this year, our presidential election a couple of years ago, the one will be a couple of years from now, right? So give me an idea about emotional loyalty. So my mother, I love her, but she was raised in a very Republican household. Okay, very, very Republican. But whenever you ask her political opinions, it always goes with the Democratic Party and a lot of the stuff that she supports. But because she has an emotional loyalty from her family to that Republican Party, she always votes Republican, even though her opinions and her experiences have her supporting Democratic ideas. So, and I love her, but it's an emotional loyalty, okay? So major shifts in those loyalties are rare. And it usually has to do with somebody taking like a class like this where they go, oh, okay, it's supposed to be, this is actually a Democratic idea. This is not a Republican idea or something like that. So we have a clear division in the United States, especially today. We've seen a lot of party polarization, which is basically just meaning that people identify more strongly with one party than they did a couple of years ago. And so this party identification, especially since it's more emotional, it's not usually based on logic as much or that sort of thing. It is very divisive. Anything that's very emotional, right, can be very divisive. I mean, it can really divide the community, right? So party identification can be very divisive. And so remember that this is part of that process of party polarization, but you can picture it as people's opinions kind of going towards the polls, okay? So which basically means that people's opinions / loyalty to one party over another has become more apparent. Okay, I mean, it's become more obvious. Okay, and it's gotten stronger over the years. So over here, you can see this is a graph taken from your book, okay, and March of 2020. Okay, so this is right before, it's like 8 months before the presidential election. Okay, so as you can see, why do I say there's a lot more political polarization? Well, if you look at these numbers here, overall, 46% of people are Republican. Overall, 47% are Democrat. And then if you look over here, this group right here is only 7%. Okay, independent. That means that somebody does not really side with either party. Okay, usually what they do is for the elections, they kind of see which party is supporting more of what they want to see at that time, and then that's the direction that they go. Okay, so this independent thinks the Republican Party is really matching their opinions at one time during the time of the election, then they can vote Republican. Same thing with the Democrats. Okay, they can vote Democrat. You never know which way they're going to go. But as you see here, there's not a lot of independents, right? This is because of that political socialization, that political polarization that I was talking about, how people are mainly identifying with one party over another, okay? And this one where they're very strongly Republican, very strongly Democrat, has a lot of people, right? So, political ideology. So, we have economic liberals, economic conservatives, cultural liberals, cultural conservatives. Okay, there's more issues, but these are just ones people usually think of the most. So, economic liberals. So this is when someone believes that the government should use its power to help people who are economically disadvantaged. Okay, so an economic liberal would most likely support expansion in programs like Medicaid and food stamps and those sort of things. Okay, economic conservatives. The government should leave the distribution of economic benefits largely to the workings of the free market, meaning that they believe in that trickle-down process, which is where the boss gets more money. Because he's getting more money, he'll pay his workers more. Okay? You also have cultural, social liberals. Lifestyle choices are left to the individual. Okay, it's things you'll usually see this with cases like abortion beliefs and those sorts of things. And the cultural conservatives, government can be used to promote traditional values, so not using abortion, okay? So you can have someone, and this is like those independents, those who lean Republican, lean Democrat, you can have an economic liberal who's a social conservative, okay? Likewise, you could have a social cultural liberal with an economic conservative. Okay, so remember that liberal, conservative, they are usually associated with a party because Democrats are favoring more changes in our government right now, which is why they're considered liberals, whereas Republicans want things to stay the same, which is why they're more conservatives. Okay, so they are associated with different parties, yes, but remember that they are also independently their own definition, okay? Meaning that although they are associated with those parties, that the overall meaning for one person can change, okay? So again, because you could have someone who's choosing the Democratic side because they're a strong cultural liberal, but they lean Republican with this economic conservative. Okay, because that's more of a Republican idea. Okay, I'm hoping that made more sense. So here is perceptions say the issue is a very big problem. So partisanship and policy priorities, basically saying where do the parties lie on different political issues? Okay, so climate change, as you can see, Democrats really favor issues with climate change. In other words, trying to make changes to lower climate change. Okay, Republicans, not so much. Economic inequality. Basically, things like favoring expansions on programs like Medicaid, food stamps, and WIC, and all those others. That is a very democratic, social, liberal here. Republicans, no. Okay, they want things to stay where the way that it is right now. So, terrorism, as you can see, both parties are pretty united whenever it comes to beliefs on terrorism. Both sides pretty much agree that that is a huge problem. Okay. Over here with illegal immigration, this is talking about immigration in general, the Dreamers Act, all those different things. As you can see, Republicans, this is a hot button issue for them. For Democrats, not so much. Okay? So, many politics are seen through a lens of group affinity, meaning that groups that you are a part of tend to have an influence on your political views. Okay? So, for example, someone who's very religious, very devout Christian, is most likely a social conservative, meaning that they're most likely very against abortion and all those sorts of things. Okay. Economic class. This is things like if you are struggling, so you're at the lower economic class, doing decent, that's the middle class, and doing really, really well, that's the higher class, can have an effect on how you feel politically. Okay, especially whenever they start bringing in issues like those social programs like Medicaid and food stamps and all those different things. Okay, region. This can also have a huge influence, especially if you live in places like Texas. We are changing our overall population makeup and party leaning and all those different things are changing. But let's say like 10, 20 years ago, we were still very Republican, right? So that had a huge influence on people's political opinions, right? Same thing in like places like California. It's very Democratic, right? So that has a huge influence on those people's political leanings, okay? Race and ethnicity. So because of the way our history is, because of what has happened historically, there are groups that are still trying to, get above that that barrier that was placed on them so many years ago, which is why we do see more urban, more poor neighborhoods tend to be more minority groups. Okay, so because of that, we do see race and ethnicity usually tend to follow the same patterns as economic class. Okay. Gender. So males tend to, I always say tend to, not everybody, tend to lean Republican, okay? Females tend to lean Democrat, and a lot of that has to do with the Democrats' position on abortion. And then generation and age. Remember, each generation has had major life experiences that are completely unique to them. Right? We had some in the 50s and 60s that really experienced the Red Scare. And so communism really affected them. Whereas communism for someone younger is like, yeah, I care, but at the same time, it's just not high on my radar. Okay, right? Someone who went to 9/11 would really have a strong opinion about keeping the border safe from terrorists, right? Someone who's been through COVID might have a strong opinion on whether the government should have a huge influence on public safety or not, right? All those different things, okay? So generations are a beast unto themselves in that those different age groups tend to have the same major life experiences, okay? So, party loyalties in the states. And this book jumps around a lot. So, competitive states are purple, as you can see. So I was talking about, if you take my Texas government, you'll see Texas is a swing state. We've had a lot of immigration, and we've had a lot of people coming in from traditionally Democratic states like California that are actually starting to change the way our state tends to vote. Also, the younger generation growing up tends to be Democrat, so it's also been starting to tip the scales on which party has power in our state, which is why you see we are a competitive state. Over here with these red, this is these big agricultural centers, the breadbasket. Over here too, we have agriculture, but we also have the Bible Belt. Okay, so over here is where all of that industry was, and we still have big business over here. Okay, so when people identify with more than one group, their group loyalty to any one group is diminished. Okay, meaning that the more groups you associate with, especially if those groups tend to disagree with each other on political opinions, the less stronger you feel about different political issues. Okay, so if you completely agree with every single Republican thing on their platform, or if you completely agree with every single Democratic thing on their platform, your party loyalty, your group loyalty is going to be very strong, correct? You're going to be like, okay, yes, that's the party I want to go with. That's the one I'm staying with. End of story, right? Whereas, let's say you are, let's say, I don't want to go too hot here. Let's say you are pro-abortion, so that is Democrat, right? But you're also anti-business regulation, which is Republican, right? Let's say you're also you don't like all of the regulations being put on businesses for COVID, so that's a Republican, right? But then you're also, let's say you like the concept, you really support the concept of sanctuary cities. Well, that's Democrat, right? So the more that you're cross-cut into different groups, the more that you associate with more than one group, it really starts to diminish, meaning it really starts to lessen how loyal you are to that group. Okay, because you could really swing either way. Okay, so, and that is known as identity politics. It's the situation in which people base their concerns on a group identity, such as race, religion, immigration, COVID concerns, abortion concerns, all those different things, and align yourself with those who share that identity and against those who don't. But again, remember, the more that you're cross-cut, meaning the more that you identify with more than one group, the less loyal, the less emotional you usually are about it. So delegate view versus trustee view. So this has to do with our, and I'm going to write this on here, our representatives. Okay, when I say representatives, I'm talking about the legislature. There's a group that I really like to use as an example on this one. So our representatives face a major decision on how they're going to conduct themselves whenever they are in Washington, D.C. So delegate view of political representation is that they should act in response to what their constituents say they want. Basically, delegate view is whenever they want to go with exactly what their voters are saying. Okay? So let's say that we have a Democratic representative in Washington, D.C. But the Democratic representative would usually vote nay on any sort of immigration regulation, correct? But let's say that a majority of their constituents have a very pro-immigration regulation opinion, meaning that they support immigration regulation. So then that representative has a huge choice. Okay, should they follow this delegate view of what their constituents say? Because having a whole bunch of immigration regulation is against the Democratic Party, right? Should they follow what their constituents say, their voters? Or should they follow the trustee point of view? So this is they should exercise the constituents' concerns, but also have their judgment about the policies that will best serve their interest. So this person, let's say if it's with the immigration regulation, okay, let's say that a majority of their constituents, their voters, are pro-regulation, okay? So then that person should be voting whenever it comes to immigration, anything that has some sort of regulation of immigration, they should be voting yes to it, okay? Even though they're Democrats, so it goes against their party, okay? But what tends to happen is that the representatives have to view their overall political party. Why? Because if they lose the support of their party, they completely lose support in Congress. Meaning that any kind of thing that they want to put on the floor, any kind of thing they want to talk about or focus on is not going to happen because they've already been basically blacklisted by their party. Okay? So let's say that same person, if they follow the delegate view to what their constituents and voters want, pro-regulation of the immigration, then they would vote yay. But following the path they are most likely going to take because they have to support their party to keep any sort of influence in Congress, they're most likely going to take the trustee route, which would have them voting nay. Okay, meaning voting against any immigration regulation. Okay, so I'm not saying it's what I support, I'm just saying it's just an example. So I like to try and stay neutral as possible. So several obstacles stand in the way of governing by public opinion. One is those contradictions, the trustee view versus the delegate view, right? The economics versus the conservatives versus the liberals, even different regions. So there's a lot of different things that serve to really try to, you have to find a balance between all of them to be able to really form a political opinion. Weak understanding of the issues. So someone where, let's say, where do you stand on the 19th Amendment? That's women's suffrage. It's women's ability to vote. Someone who's like, the 19th Amendment, I don't know what that is, right? But the moment you tell them, oh, well, that's women's ability to vote, like, oh, yes, okay, yes, I really support that. If you never said anything, though, where they're just like, okay, well, how do you support the 19th Amendment? They might have no opinion on it because it's a weak understanding of it, of the issue that they're talking about. Okay? So, mastery of the issues is not necessary for an opinion to be of value, but weak understanding can make it difficult for policymakers to respond. Okay? I always like to give this example. It's a ridiculous example, but it kind of gets the point across. So let's say that a representative's constituents, that's the people who voted them into office, want I-35 to be made of gold. They don't care how it happens. They just want it to be made of gold. Okay? Let's say these people are all people in Texas. And the representative says, okay, I can make I-35 made out of gold, but you are going to have to pay a hefty tax for us to be able to afford those materials. All of a sudden, with Texas, right? Texans just not like taxes. Their understanding of how to accomplish that goal is going to have a huge impact on how they are understanding how the representative is handling it. Okay? Representative says, you're going to have a high tax if you want this to happen. And then the people are going, no, I don't want a high tax. I just want I-35 to be made out of gold. Okay. And the representative would be saying, well, if this is what you want, this is how it's going to have to happen. Okay. So people do not always have an understanding of how to accomplish the goals that they want. Okay, so it makes it kind of a little bit more difficult, especially whenever that goal involves an increase in taxes. It's going to be making it a little bit more difficult for that representative to really act in a way that's going to be approved by the people. Okay, so boundaries of action. So officials normally must operate within a boundary of what people will accept. Okay, things like minor changes to Social Security, those types of things. But sweeping changes in public opinion invariably lead to lasting and substantial changes in direction of national policy. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that people usually have an opinion that is really affected by major events. Okay, let's say the Great Depression. A lot of people, especially big business, would not have wanted the government to interfere prior to the Great Depression. Okay, especially big business. They would have wanted the government to stay out of it. Okay, but whenever the Great Depression hit, there were a lot of people affected, right? Almost every single person in the United States was affected to a great extent in the Great Depression. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of people, the majority of the nation, supported government intervention, okay, in business, what have you. Okay, so because of this, those substantial changes in the direction of national policy usually have an impact. Okay, things that were created during the Great Depression, those social programs, things like Social Security, and then later in the 1960s when we saw the addition of Medicaid and WIC and all those different things, that was a change in our nation that stayed put. It stayed there. Okay, so these changes in public opinion usually lead to a lasting, more permanent change. Okay, so again, prior to the Great Depression, people did not really support government intervention in business. Some of them did not support social programs. Not everybody, just some of them did not support social programs. And after the Great Depression, there was a lot more acceptance of government regulation of business. There was a lot more acceptance in expansion of those social programs, okay, that have lasted to this day. And then abrupt shifts in opinion on a salient issue can change the boundaries of acceptable action. Okay, so remember our salient, I believe it's up here. I'm going to remind you of the definition real quick. Down here, here we go. So salience, remember, that's how important people think an issue is among other issues. Remember how we talked about how the way you ask things is really going to have an impact on, and the order that you ask them is going to have an impact on how important people think they are, right? So the shift to anti-free trade policies in response to Donald Trump's candidacy for presidency. Why is this on here? Because anti-free trade, remember that Donald Trump is was a Republican candidate, right? Anti-free trade, anything messing with trade and businesses is very much against Republican Party, right? But you saw that the minute that, well, not the minute that, but whenever Donald Trump had a very strong opinion about these free trade policies, right, Republicans started changing their tune and supporting him on it. Okay, so that's an abrupt shift in opinion on an issue. Okay, and then congressional representatives pay close attention to public opinion. Okay, so they tend to favor the position that will garner them the most support in their next election. So, for example, immigration. For example, whenever you see people campaigning this year for Texas government, they are most likely going to be targeting issues that the people are really going to care about. Okay, so you're probably going to see a lot of things with COVID. You're probably going to see things still with immigration and those sorts of things. Okay, so that is it for chapter 6